All right.
Well, do you mind if I weigh in on your first question first?
Sure.
So, I was at no point surprised by what I heard out of John MacArthur. John MacArthur has been who he is now for the better part of what he says. He's been preaching for, 60 years?
Mm-hmm.
I think my greatest disappointment and the melancholy that I had when I came away from this was watching Ben Shapiro. I have had, historically, an enormous amount of respect for Ben Shapiro. I think he's doing an extraordinary body of work, particularly with the millennials of the world, and challenging their fundamental socialist, tribalist, Marxist assumptions. But Ben considers himself, without question, a child of the Enlightenment. And he's intellectually sophisticated enough to know what that means. Now, like most people who hold a faith, they reserve a space for a mystical part of themselves. And I understand that. I understand where that comes from, having been that person. But I watched that interview, how to explain? I understand why Jeremiah cried. I understand why, because Jeremiah spent his life trying to explain to the people of Israel, to the leadership of Israel, why their course of action was going to result in their own destruction. And he kept trying to explain why what they believed and what they thought was not going to deliver them, but was in fact going to enslave them. And Ben Shapiro has two major comments, and unfortunately they're buried under the subtext of his ongoing questions. But his understanding of what the Enlightenment is catastrophically wrong. And this has me more... Johnny Mac, as I affectionately call him, I understand he's probably insulted by that, but it doesn't matter. He's lost. He is medieval theology roaring out of the Dark Ages and doesn't understand what he's doing, and he's never going to change. He is John MacArthur, and he's going to be that. But Ben Shapiro, who is an avowed child of the Enlightenment, for him to have such a fantastically wrong understanding of the roots of the Enlightenment, what it really did, and the fact that he can say and not understand, the fact that he can say that Immanuel Kant tried to systematize a philosophical framework, a philosophical justification for reason, for morality, from a base of reason, and say he failed, is to tell me everything I need to know about what he does not understand about the Enlightenment. And so if one of our leading, in my mind, next generation thinkers and defenders of conservatism can be this wrong about the nature of the Enlightenment and what America did and how it is, and then try to justify America's failures by a regression into a body of doctrine that slaughtered his people with impunity. The doctrine, even though John MacArthur would probably reject this on its root, the realities is that Reformation theology, Luther, Calvin, and all of the intellectual children, all the rest, they were vociferously and violently opposed to Jews. And the fact that he can sit there in the same space, embrace John MacArthur's doctrine, and not understand what a fundamental affront it is, not only to his own race and his own body of doctrine, but to the Enlightenment, it killed me.
And thank you for that. And I am going to jump ahead, and I'm going to address what John is just said before I go back to what I was originally going to talk about. And that is when they were talking about social justice, politics and social justice, and how churchians, religious people, whether Jew or Christians, people with a moral book, I guess you would talk them, say, or people with the Bible, whether Jew or whatever, MacArthur talks about, they're in the subject of moral authority, okay? He said around the 5-minute mark that he can't support a practical atheist. And then he says this, let me see here. At the 5:15 mark, MacArthur says, somebody, for example, who advocates the slaughter of babies, which is murder by any biblical definition, any moral definition, that is not a just ruler. That is not a man of mercy. When Moses was selected, the rulers who would blah, blah, blah. The specific quote I'm looking for is later on, where he says, the 7:12 mark, anybody who advocates or support the killing of babies, I can't vote for that, don't care who the other guy is you're looking in some ways that the lesser of two evils, but you always are inside society. He talks about looking, looking towards the better of the two evils or whatever, but he says if somebody advocates abortion, okay, I can't buy into that. So in other words, if a leader like Trump isn't going to be anti-abortion, okay, maybe it's a good practical ruler, all right, but he's like Brett Kavanaugh that says, no, I'm not going to overturn Roe versus Wade. It's precedent. Okay, I'm against it, but it's right. So MacArthur's like, I can't buy into any of that. Is a principle for who I vote for. If he's not against abortion, I don't care who he is, what he stands for, he can't get my vote. Okay? However, he's given his whole life ideology and ministry towards Protestant Reformation ideology. Right? Yeah. Okay? The witch wars, okay? How many witches did John Calvin have killed? Luther was indirectly responsible for thousands of accused witches being murdered.
It would be a good intellectual exercise,
right,
where you're going. Let's assume that we do not have a constitutional form of government like we have, but let's say we have a Protestant. Right. Let's say we have a Protestant church state, right? And you have a leader who says, if you're not going to toe the line of Protestant orthodoxy, we're going to burn you at the stake. Right. Right. Would he? Okay, you going to vote for that guy? Right. So is that a moral? Would that be as much of a moral dilemma for MacArthur? Right. If you're going to be consistent with the orthodoxy that you follow. John's got it. John?
So part of my challenge with this whole MacArthur interview, unfortunately, John MacArthur, it's a tragedy, frankly, that he is an intellectual leader within modern Christianity, because he's intellectually all over the map. Right. And he is classically neo-Calvinist. I believe it because it's biblical. It's biblical because I believe it. Okay. The intellectual tautology that runs throughout the entirety of his arguments. And so he can toss out pretty much any validation which in his mind consecrates his view. Right. And then reject anything that in his mind doesn't consecrate his view. And so I think that when you're tripping down the path expecting John MacArthur to be intellectually consistent, I don't think he thinks he tries to be intellectually consistent. Ben Shapiro towards the end of the interview said something like he was trying to discuss the philosophical framework between Christianity and Judaism. And one of the things that John MacArthur says, well, I don't believe it's a philosophy. I think it's a revelation.
Yeah.
Well, that explains Miles, because he never has to at any point defend a rational assertion. All he ever has to say is, well, this is the revelation that was given to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to pin John MacArthur down on his rational inconsistency throughout this entire interview, I've got pages of notes here on logical inconsistencies, and a couple of them we probably ought to touch on. But
Right.
his fundamental premise is you have a moral responsibility to submit your mind to any given authority. That's his fundamental. That's his epistemology, if you will. And anything that deviates from that, in his mind, is a rebellion and a rejection of God. It's
Right.
not really more complicated than that.
I call it the gospel of authority.
Yes, it is. That's a great way to put it.
Okay. I mean, look at the Catholic Church. Why is it still? How could the Catholic Church possibly be thriving? Well, a good Catholic friend of mine told me. All right, Paul, the Catholic Church was here first. It was here a 1,500, almost 1,500 years before Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
If everyone would just obey the Pope, there'd be unity.
Yeah. Well, and you've said this
There it
yourself.
is.
You've said this yourself many times. The Church, authentic Protestant Orthodoxy, has always had more in common, intellectually and philosophically, with liberal ideologies
Right,
than conservative ones.
right,
And it's only in recent years that they're starting to become more, not more, but less, let's say, less subtle about it.
right. So, okay, I ask, in conjunction with that, what was Plato's definition of social justice? Okay, Plato's.
Is this Stump the Bartender time? I don't think.
Yeah, it is.
Did he ever use social justice in the same sentence?
Yeah. So basically, Plato's definition of social justice was unity around any given philosophy of any given philosopher king. So, unity, social justice equals unity around the societal authority, okay, or the dictates of the philosopher king. Okay, and of course we know, you think past that a little bit, okay, and the problem is, there's more than one philosopher king in the world. They all think that they have the philosophy that's going to save mankind, and that's where we get wars, right? Okay, because they're all warring against each other to save the world from the other guy who doesn't have the right philosophy. But it's interesting that, of course, you know, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church are grounded in Platonism. And basically, Plato's definition of social justice was unity around a central authority. Okay?
He didn't couch it in those terms because
No,
social
he
justice
didn't.
is a 21st century term. But what would have been his word for
I
that?
forget, because that's how Dr. Apple is the guy's name, who's kind of a scholar on Plato. I read his book. Dr. Apple wrote a book on Plato with another guy. That's how they framed it. Do I remember enough about that book to know if that's how Plato would have framed it? No. Okay, but that's the gist of it. Okay. Any insertions here before we go on?
Well, I think that you hit right at the edge of what the fundamental conflict within this particular interview is. These are two men who fundamentally believe that the only way man can identify morality is by a mystical, otherworldly source. And they have both arrived at the conclusion that the distribution point of that morality is the Judeo-Christian God. The challenge, and I have said this repeatedly, the moment you say that morality is the byproduct of another mystical realm, and man can't know it unless the gods are in the business of telling him how to act, the next question I have for you is, well, which God? Which one?
Right.
And then morality becomes subjective.
Well, morality, the very subjectivity you think, because the logic goes loosely something like this. God is an absolute. God gives absolute moral value. Man then has a absolute plumb line. That's the loose logic. But the problem is if man is fundamentally corrupt to understand what is good, then how does he know which God is good?
Right.
Who is in this absolute moral plumb
And that's
line?
where the subjectivity comes in, because Muslims believe their morality is just as valid when they can go around and claim and call for jihad and murder infidels. They believe that they're being moral, that they're being absolutely moral in what they're doing.
And so why isn't the morality of Aphrodite valid? Why isn't the morality of Kali valid? And so, like I said, the moment you disabuse man of any moral ability and ultimately say he needs an absolute moral code that he can't find by reason, and that's crucial, the moment you draw that separation, you have tossed man into an abyss. And then you said, well, so the first question then man must answer is, well, which God is it?
Right.
And the answer to that question is, well, the one willing to do the most violence. The people in service to whatever God that is who are willing to do the most violence. Which means that the very subjectivity that they think they're trying to get rid of is endemic to the worldview that morality is the byproduct of an extraterrestrial mystical realm that man has no association with.
And I get into arguments with that all the time on people with Facebook. You know, from time to time I'll get into an argument with somebody on Facebook about this issue of authority. I said, this is why authority cannot be your frame of reference, because how do you know which authority?
Right.
What makes your authority the right one and the authority of Buddha the wrong one? How do you know? It's
How do you know?
Well, because it's God. Well, so what? I just want to say, so what? And they just keep going, well, because it is. And they have no answer for you.
And this is exactly why I said that within the interview, the Johnny Mac logic, the underlying tautology that is everywhere within it's biblical because I believe it because it's biblical. I believe in this God because he's the right one because I believe him. It really is no more complicated than that intellectually. And so all of the proof texting that he does, all the Bible quoting he does is in service to his fundamental assumption, I have an intellectual obligation to subordinate my mind to whatever's in this book. It doesn't matter how inconsistent that is, and by definition I won't even answer the inconsistencies because they're just really not inconsistencies. And this is why I found the Ben Shapiro reaction to this interview, and the reason he gave this man so much accolade, I'm like, Ben, come on, dude. You're much smarter than this. You would never tolerate this kind of intellectual sloppiness out of your leftist adversaries.
No, if MacArthur's sitting out in the college audience, he gets skewered.
Oh yeah, he wouldn't have gotten 6 cents. He certainly wouldn't have been introduced as the great John MacArthur, which I must say I found this fantastically ironic that a resident wormy Calvinist would let somebody attach that honorific to his name. The great John MacArthur.